and got married, and I have this kind of gap that I think happens to a lot of artists who have families, and especially women. I mean, to be frank. So I was married to another artist who's a painter, and I guess that's something that I think has gotten a lot better. But for me, it represented this kind of time where it's just it's hard to have a child and like be up all night with them, and then like try to get in your studio with dark circles under your eyes, and you're also working, because I had started teaching at Richland, and so there was just this period of, I would say, almost 10 years, like 8 or 9 years between teaching full time, which was supportive of my art. I could get some art done in blocks, like the summer and December, and but in general, having a family is rough, and especially if the other person is also a creative person and you're trying to like balance things. And so I wouldn't say I was unproductive, because like I said, I've always been really hard on myself about like almost like, you paid for this degree, so you better do something. So but that's actually when I really got into doing collage, because when I left Tyler, I was still painting and painting on fabric and doing some of the things I described earlier. And then I I just stopped, because painting especially, I think, is a process that you need continuity. Like if you're painting and then you take 6 days and you come back, your energy's changed, the paint is dried, you're like, where do I start again? It's just it's one of these almost I would say almost like you get in a zone, do you know what I mean? And it's hard to be pulled out of that. And so I tried, but I just could not continue it. And so the first thing I started doing was, and this was just a recourse, I started cutting up the paintings that I had. And then I also was doing a lot of ink drawing. And actually, I didn't even really have a studio space, because I had a little, 2-bedroom house, and 1 bedroom was like, for my son. So I was working at the kitchen table kind of thing. And what I started doing is I would be really cheap and bring home excess material from the college that, like, they always had these little announcements like, we have, a box of file folders. Does anybody want them? And I'd be like, I do. So I would get like correction fluid, file folders, those little red and yellow tabs where you're supposed to sign. Just anything. Highlighter markers. I had tons of highlighters. And I started making these weird little ink drawings that had all this kind of like tabs and highlighted stuff, and they were all on manila folders, and I loved them. They were kind of cool, but mostly it was just gratifying for me because I could finish one in 2 or 3 hours. And it gave me, for better for worse, this kind of sense of at least that I was doing something. I can't say it was a complete body of work, but it got me through that really tough time of like not having a studio. I never had postpartum depression, but I did get to this point where I was really frustrated because it was like I felt like I had lost my mojo or my persona, and I was just now this cute little boy's mom. So
no, it's funny. My yesterday was our wedding anniversary, 17 years, and my wife was telling my daughter, we were talking about names and things, and how she was talking about how much anxiety she had, like right after we got married, and people would introduce us as Mr. and Mrs. Craig Gould, who are like, well, she's not in that. Like, she, her first name's not there, her old last name's not there. It's like, where's my identity? Right? And just like, it took a while for her to, to adjust to that, but B, like, maybe that's really not fair for culture to do in the first place. And try to say that you're just Mrs. So and so instead of you're your own person, right?
Yeah, right.
But it sounds like those projects that you're doing at your table, sometimes people don't like the word practice, but I mean, that was, part of what you were doing. You were maintaining.
I was storyboarding.
Right. I mean, you were just, you were maintaining, maybe you weren't going out and running a marathon, but you were staying in shape.
Yeah,
right?
I think, exactly. And I think also, and my advice just to even when I was teaching to my students is don't underestimate those things because they take you places. Mm-hmm. And what I learned from it was at some point they were just supposed to be fillers till I got back to painting. And then one day I turned the corner and realized, I don't really want to paint anymore. I'm so happy doing this. I just want to take this to the next level. Mm-hmm. And it was just this kind of mental release because I, really kind of uptight. My mind was like, well, you should, you spent all these years studying painting and you worked so hard to get through those horrible paintings that you did in college, and you should be painting. And then all of a sudden I was like, no, I really like this and actually I think they're pretty good, and so I think that little activity turned into what I'm doing now. I can see that as kind of like really the predecessor, because eventually I just even stopped drawing with the ink. I mean, I still like to draw. I draw quite a bit, but it was the freedom of these non-traditional sort of materials that were just whatever was laying around. And then I started I was cutting up magazines and adding magazines, and it reminded me, it was almost like going back to this source of joy, because back when I was at Booker T in high school, I used to skip school sometimes with this. No. Yeah, with this friend of mine who was in the theater department. And, since the high school's downtown, right, it was like the most benign school skipping. We would go to the library because who skipped school to go to the public library? We would go to the fourth floor, and there was a guy there. I can't remember his first name. His last name was Held. I want to say it was like John Held Jr., something like that. John Held, I think. He got us turned on to he was a librarian in the art section. He turned us on to mail art, and a lot of my friends were like, that was like the punk rock zine movement, so people were making zines, and we were really into all these kind of the beginning of all those sort of art underground comic books like Art School Confidential and Gary Panter and all that stuff. So we liked all those things, and we, you were also still it was like a big deal to make a cassette for somebody, and you make cassette art covers, right? You know what I mean? Yeah. So there was a whole lot of photocopying going on, and so we would skip and go to the library, and then he was really nice. He'd let us just use the photocopier and didn't charge us, and we would photocopy all these books. There was this one book that was literally like an old advertising clip art kind of thing. I copied so many pages out of that, and then we'd make mail art and send them off to people we didn't know around the world and get art back. Wow. And so years later, I had this revelation where I was like, oh my God, this is I'm back to having a really good time. And that was the lesson in Rome, was if you're not having fun, then why are you doing it? Right. And so that's one thing that I can say about collage is that, there's all these sort of, I think it's metaphorical, it's a lot like what we experience in the world and all that, but at the heart of it, it's I am, I'm a cutter. I like scissors. Right. I like cutting. I like just that whole, I like the mess, things all over the floor, and it's fun. And it just reminds me of making cassette covers, Sure. having a good time.
Yeah.
So.
And so at what point? So how long have you been doing collage? Cut collages on arches. Like what are we looking at?
Okay, so I guess it's been about now like 4 or 5 years. I mean, I started out cutting out a lot. I had a whole stash. So this is kind of a little side story, but the artist I was married to, he recently died. He was pretty young. He was in his 50s, and he was from Bangladesh.
Wow.
And we had been divorced for a while, but we remained friends. And he, at some point, gave me this. Actually, he didn't give it to me. What happened is he, would come and visit off and on, and he had some friends here, and he would stay here for a few months and then go back. And he had this thing happen to him where he was taking a bunch of gifts back, and someone in the airport ripped him off and like took all the stuff out of his bag and replaced it with this enormous roll of posters, movie posters.
Oh my God.
Like Bollywood type of, but really cheap, actually like B-rated.
Yeah.
Like Bangladesh is like a sub film culture to
Right.
India even. But it was just the right, he had a duffel bag, so it was just the right weight and size that he didn't even notice until he came home and he opened it up, and I'm sure he freaked out,
Oh, man.
But so on another trip he came back, he was like, here, do you want these? And I was like, these things have traveled back and forth now
Right.
twice. So I'm like, okay, yeah, I better do something with them. And so that was about 4 or 5 years ago. I started cutting them up. And what I did was I was really interested in not the people. I had been making collages that were more like almost like Dada type of collages where you put different pieces of bodies together and things like that. But these posters, what was really interesting was the hair and the skin and the clothing were offset wrong, so the colors were really weird. So I just started getting really obsessed with the skin and the hair.
Got it.
And I would cut them out in a way that they looked familiar but unfamiliar, and that's how I sort of hit on this almost like organic forms. So I liked the presence of the body and the absence at the same time. It was like they're there but they're not there.
Right.
And I worked my way through like the skin and hair, and then I looked and I had a pile of clothes. So then I started doing this whole series that were just like these weird pieces from scraps of saris, but some of the movies are more modern, so then there were like jeans and t-shirts, and it was just, oh my God, like a candy store, like
Right.
so much material, and I could go large, I could go small.
Sure.
And
but at this point, you're not literally cutting these things out. You're finding textures and finding your own shapes in there.
Yes, I'm like now making my own shapes and extracting. I'm just looking at it like almost like a palette.
Right.
So I'm creating my own shapes and my own format. There's nothing. I'm not cutting out a figure and using the figure, and they're literally like now just snippets, like elements of things. And so that kind of just took me down this path, and eventually I worked through that pile, and then I had to come up with new material, and that was sort of a little bit of an existential crisis, because I was like, am I beholden to the imagery? Like, do I need to go out and look for more?
Yeah, go on eBay and
Right.
buy like 80 Bangladesh posters.
Right, like vintage posters. And I was like, no, that's not what this is about. This is, and at that point it started migrating too into other things. And so I just realized like it opened up a world for me, because then I started taking some of these images and printing. Now I've gone and made some large digital prints and blown those up pretty big so that they pixelate, cut those up, and I'm working them into 3-dimensional pieces.
Right.
And just recently I moved to like a dye bond, a metal. So now it's kind of like I guess they're my Frank Stella homages.
Right.
Because I would say that's sort of in my mind the closest thing, like in the sense of he's kind of a collage painter.
Are you printing onto the metal, or are you finding metal that already has?
Well, that's an interesting thing. Right now, I'm just printing onto the metal. I make my